1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. My guest today is a good friend of mine and one of the most talented guitar players I've ever met. And his name is Will McFarlane. He's a pillar of the Muscle Shoals recording scene and has been since 1980. We'll get to all of that because he has way more to offer. So welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, Will. Thanks for being my guest today.
It's great to be here, Andreas.
So I usually start my conversation with a simple question: is what is like the earliest musical memory you can remember?
You know, my real earliest one that I remember, and I know I had much before this because my father once told me that my mother sang around the house all the time. But she passed when I was very young, so I think I have a blank space back there, you know. But I remember, believe it or not, hearing Bobby Darin singing Dream Lover. I was 5 or 6, you know, and it just had this rhythm and thing. It was just a pop tune that caught me that I just loved. And I know that sounds crazy. I was probably maybe 6, and I just wanted to be musical. And so my dad was overseas at the time and in the Navy. And so I was staying with family in Texas, and they said, well, we got to get them started. So they got all the kids started in Texas with a lady named Alwana, a little woman who gave voice lessons to all the kids in town and put little youth choirs together and things like that. And I started singing. And she was hip. She knew when I told her I liked Dream Lover, she, I think, got the music for that for me, you know, and Poison Ivy by the Coasters. And it wasn't just like la, 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 you know, it was, she taught me sort of the pop tunes of the day. And that would have been 1957, 8. And so those are my first musical where I was participating musically. I was probably about 6, maybe.
Okay. Was guitar the first instrument you picked up, or was there another?
No. When my dad remarried, and she was very musical, and she had Platters records around the house, and she could tell I just loved music as a kid. So at about 7, I guess, she said, you ought to take some piano lessons. And I said, great, that'd be great. And there was a piano in the house, and I guess maybe I'd sat down and plunked at it or something. So my stepmother gave me piano lessons. And it's funny because I realized right at the beginning I had a pretty quick ear. So my reading chops stayed really low. I could learn a Schumann sonata and not really know how to read it. You know, she'd play it for me and I'd know how it goes. I might glance at it, but I've never been a great reader. But my ear would always pick up on this stuff. And I played the piano from 7 to almost 12. And in, of course, February 9th, 1964, was a seminal evening in my life. I watched the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and of course there was no piano in the band, but it was more than that. It was like somewhere deep in my soul, I just went, that's what I do. That's, you know, so after that I got the guitar.
And there's a whole generation of musicians who, that was their
aha moment.
Their light bulb, for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So did you then already imagine yourself being a musician for life, or how did that come about? Because I know you're a very smart guy, and so that kind of runs in your family of being like highly educated people, and I'm sure that could have been a career path for you too.
Well, you're very intuitive there. My father believed education was the most important thing in life. It was honestly his number one focus in life, a very brilliant man. He had an engineering degree from Naval Academy. He had a master's in logistics from the War School in Monterey, Pentagon, and he had a Juris Doctorate in practice law. I mean, he was a brilliant man. And he really truly believed that if you didn't have 2 postgraduate degrees, you just wasted your mind. My mother, who, as I mentioned earlier, had passed when I was 5, I didn't know till I was an adult that she had perfect pitch, and she had a music degree from the University of Texas. So I didn't have her as a daily influence in my life. I had a left-brained engineering test pilot for my parent, but in my DNA, there was this musical thing that always felt like if I wasn't being musical, something was wrong with me on the inside. But my father's was outspoken. Music is part of a well-rounded education, but you don't do it for a living. So I just figured that was it. I would never be able to be a musician. Most of my young days, from the time I saw the Beatles, I bet you it wasn't a month or 6 weeks that I had a band together. And we were doing Beatles songs and, Searchers and Dave Clark 5 and everything that was the Mercy beat, And then we found out, wow, C. Berry wrote this one. Who's Chuck Berry, and you found out about him and Little Richard. And so I had a little junior high rock and roll band, within a month and a half of seeing the Beatles. And yet, if I got a B in school, Dad would restrict me from the band because it was obviously distracting me from my true thing in life. And every couple of years, he drove me down to the Naval Academy and assumed I would go to the Naval Academy and be a fighter pilot, really. And so my senior year was a very volatile year. I got out of high school in 1969. And that was just a volatile year, Vietnam was at its height. We just come out of the Tet Offensive. People were putting soldiers down. But I admired soldiers. But at that point, I just knew I wasn't one. I just knew I wasn't a soldier. And I went to college very briefly because there was a lottery that year. And they picked your birthday out of a hat, basically. And that's the order they drafted you. And they picked my number 218, so they didn't call me. And as soon as I knew I wasn't going to immediately be drafted, I just dropped out of college. And my father was, well, what are you going to do with your life? You're throwing your life away. And I said, Dad, I've got to take a shot at music. And I almost did it under duress. I told him, I'm not doing this to be rebellious to you or to find significance in life. I just honestly, Dad, feel that if I don't play music, something's broken. I'm disconnected in some way. So I sort of fell in it. I started playing coffee shops and, you know what I mean? I moved into Greenwich Village and we started doing open mic night at places that, you'd see the pictures of Bob Dylan and Paul Simon on the, Gertie's and, Cafe One, places like that. And we were just doing open mic nights I was 17 and just, living on brown rice and pancakes and trying to be a musician.
Yeah. So you had your first big break as a professional musician, getting noticed by Bonnie Raitt and then joining her band. What took you from the coffee houses to that point where you were ready for that moment?
I can honestly attribute it almost to one man. We were all young. He was probably 19. I think he's a couple of years older than me. I was 17. Maybe he was 20 and I was 18, whatever, during that period of time. We were a trio. I was songwriting, and I had a couple of high school buddies, a guitar player and a bass player. And we were sort of like what they might call now Americana. Back then, I don't know what it was. It was just sort of rootsy, country, folk rock trio that we did harmonies. And but of course, in high school, I liked everything on the radio. I liked Otis Redding, and I liked Cream, and I liked, but we met up with a drummer, and one of my buddy's friends had a barn in upstate New York, and we went up and just woodshedded up there, and we met these guys, and we got a house. It was like a hippie house, with beads for doors, and the band set up in the living room. And Paul Siegel is his name. He's a very accomplished man at this point. He did
I got to meet him in New York.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Paul had 2,000 records. And he just started saying, Will, you would love this. And he exploded my mind. I mean, truly, with roots and just every Motown record and all of Booker T and the Meters. They kill. And I realized I loved playing rhythm guitar. We had a lead guitar player in the band. I probably played the guitar for 5 or 6 years before I ever even took a solo because I didn't care. I loved listening to the hi-hat and being a rhythm player. Those were the guys that really moved my soul, and the Meters really did it for me. And so Paul, and he'd say, "How about this, guys?" And we'd just try to learn it. So my musical education began in a farmhouse in upstate New York, living together with the band. And if we wanted to learn a Buddy Holly song, we learned a Buddy Holly song. If we wanted to learn a Muddy Waters or a Howlin' Wolf song, we learned it, or Jerry Reed, who I loved, or Merle Haggard. We had a live Merle Haggard record. We did Silver Wings. And we, learned Stones. And we had Bobby Womack stuff, and we learned his version of It's All Over Now. And so my musical age became older than my chronological age. And Paul helped with that. He just had, I don't think anybody loves music more than Paul, and he imparted that to all of us. And I started to just love music and listen to all kinds. And so when I moved to Cambridge, because we heard that was a great place to gig, all the clubs were hiring bands 4 and 5 nights a week. And so we moved up to Cambridge as a band. And the band broke up very soon thereafterwards. I just sort of hired out as a rhythm guitar player in this band. And Dick Waterman, her management, who I owe a lot to, her manager, he's the guy who went and found Son House after knowing, and he went and found Arthur Crudup and Fred McDowell, and he introduced Bonnie to Fred McDowell. I mean, and where would her slide playing be without, you know what I mean? He wasn't just a photojournalist or a music lover. I mean, he has definitive pictures of Bobby Kennedy and Ted Williams. I mean, he's just a great photographer and a great thinker, unusual man, and highly gifted and intelligent. And he just started showing up about every other gig I played, just these little bars, and people told me who he was. And I was like, wow. And one night he just showed up, sat down in the front row with Bonnie. And it was the last song of the set. We were doing an Al Green song. I don't remember exactly which one. I think it was like, Let's Stay Together. Of course, I loved Teenie Hodges. He was a rhythm player. And I was just the guitar player in this band. And right as the set ended, she just jumped up and said, "Well, introduce me." And I was like, and we just stood and talked and all this. And she'd just been out as a duo with Freebo for years. And she would open for Little Feat or maybe Orleans or Paul Butterfield's Better Days or things like that.
Did you know of her at that point at all?
I did, because I had seen her in concert in 1972 or something, opening for Paul Butterfield's Better Days. And her voice is, I mean, if you ask me, she's one of the she may be the finest interpretive singer of my generation. I mean, I just think once Bonnie does a song, it's hers. It's just, who else in a way, I mean, she's just an amazing, soulful singer. And I still think that they've never even really captured her on record. I mean, because when she's in the room with you, it's like you hear overtones in her voice, and you hear just how amazingly effortless her singing is. And so she's right down front, and we're talking, and he said, well, she's going to open for Jackson on the Late for the Sky tour. And she felt she needed her own band finally. And after all, so I actually ended up being in her first full band and my first tour. I mean, I went from making, $10 a night and all the beer I could drink, to the Late for the Sky tour with Bonnie Raitt and Jackson Browne.
Yeah. Did you ever enter a recording studio pre-Bonnie Raitt?
Yeah, we demoed all our stuff. And that was a thing I can tip my hat to these days, because Sound on Sound was at a very low ebb at the time, and you had to spend a lot of money, maybe, or whatever, and the studios might be 3-track, 4-track, or whatever. So you had to get it right. You had to go in there and your background harmonies were right. You took the solo, you know what I'm saying, and your stops, and if you blew it, you had to start over again. There was no punching in or, we just didn't have the technology. And a lot of us old guys, I think, it stood us in good stead, to have to get it right the first time. And I'm not going to say that I don't mind the fact that yesterday at the session here at the NuttHouse, there were a couple of times I went, can you take the first half of that and put it with the second half of that? And, and Jimmy's so great, he can just fly things around and clean up my messes. But my original studio experiences, the whole time we were learning and doing demos and pitching deals, that 4 years between the time I dropped out of college and got hired by Bonnie. It's about 4.5 years. Yeah, we did a bunch of demos and I was hired every now and then to sing for people's like little local commercials or stuff like that. So I'd been in headphones.
Yeah. Do you still have a copy of some of those early recordings?
I wish. I think Paul might. I think there's an acetate somewhere of an actual pressing we did that would be frightening to hear right now. But I remembered I wrote a song, and all I remember was the hook when, it was talking about a girl I'd fallen in love with driving through Texas. And her name was Amarilla or whatever. And the chorus was, "You make it easy to love you, Amarilla." And I just remember that. That's the only song I remember that I wrote back then when I was 17 or 18. And they were probably pretty amateurish.
But then again, any song that sticks with you for 45 years has something to it.
Yeah. And every time, like Lynn Williams is from Amarillo. And every time he says Amarillo, I think, "You make it easy to love you, Amarillo," because I wrote that song when it's funny. I have little, I guess, numismatic brain tricks that remind me of things.
Yeah. So for that Jackson Browne tour, you joined Bonnie's band.
Yeah.
And Bonnie is a guitar player herself with a very unique style. I mean, very much steeped in that history, but she made it her own, and it's very...
Yes.
She's one of those players who we've been talking about B.B. King, with less is more. Yeah. She's certainly that.
Absolutely.
How did the two of you coexist as guitar players in the band, or maybe also learn from each other, or, add to what each other was contributing? Did you just kind of naturally just fell into it, or was there ever something discussed or between the two of you?
There was. We had a lot of conversations, and I can honestly say, getting ready for that, they actually, after Bonnie wanted me to be in the band, she had to go off tour for 3 or 4 or 5 months, and so I never heard back from her. And I sort of let it go, and I was working for a moving company, just all these out-of-work musicians doing third-floor walk-ups in Cambridge for 400,000, college students. And all of a sudden I get this call from her manager. And he said, "Hey, Will, thought I'd flag you down. We're still thinking about you. Would you be prepared to do a 50-city tour with Bonnie and Jackson Browne?" And, of course, I'd heard, These Days and Doctor My Eyes. And I was, "Well, absolutely." He goes, "Well, I'll send you her records." She had 4 records out up to Through Streetlights at that point. She sent me all 4 of them. And he said, this will probably be the set list, but I'm so glad I didn't listen to that, because not one of the songs, he said, the set list, because she decided to do other stuff and get ready for the next record, which I ended up on, which was great. But I woodshed it. I had 2 weeks, and I don't know if I've ever practiced that hard in my life to just simply, because I was never a lead guitar player up until then, really. I was the rhythm player, which is really what she needed. She needed somebody to be colorful and come up under her wing. She didn't need some hot rod over on the side. But she also wanted slide when she wasn't playing slide. So I really got my slide chops together. I played slide on Taking My Time, some even on her records.
Was that all standard tuning slide at that point, or did you?
It was for me until I discovered, or she and Lowell and Rye were all in that sort of basic G tuning. But I was cheating too, because I had to hold down the fort too. So a lot of times I'm way better just dropping the high E string to a D and keeping the rest of it standard tuning. Because I played standards so long, but every now and then, especially like we just rehearsed last night with Leroy Parnell, and he's an open A, like Lowell, but it's that G, it's the same thing as an open G tuning, which Bonnie is. And I just never got used to the straight bar. I'm used to, I'm used to moving. And so I actually have sort of a hybrid tuning. But with her, when I first ended up in the band, I think the thing that won me the gig, because everybody in LA, there's David Lindley and all of these great players in Jackson's band, and they heard Bonnie hired some guy out of a bar in Cambridge. And they're thinking, what are you thinking? You could get anybody you want in LA. And so they were real not they walked on eggshells a little around me because they assumed I was going to get fired in the first few days, But rehearsal went like a breeze because she went, well, okay, Under the Fallen Sky, and I just knew it. And you know what I'm saying? So I knew everything she wanted to do. And she went, man, this is easy. How about this? How about this? And our first rehearsal, I played it like I'd like the record. And so we went out and did the tour, and about 3 weeks into it, I got really sick. I got strep throat, and we had 3 days off, and I just sat in my hotel room with a guitar and just invented myself. This song, I'm not catching the energy in this one as well. I need to be a better soloist here. I need to play less on this one. I need to just hold it. And I invented myself in this hotel room for 3 days and sort of became one of the guys, and she kept me in her band for another 5 years after that.
And then you went into studio with her too.
Yeah, I was.
That was an important album from her for her, because I think that the biggest hit of her career up to that point came from the next album.
That's right.
That was Del Shannon's, cover of Del Shannon's Runaway.
Yeah, I'm fortunate. I played on it was her first gold record, which is amazing to think. It was that was Sweet Forgiveness. The first record I did with her was Home Plate, and they brought in John Hall as well from Orleans, who's great. I mean, he was actually the shoes I sort of had to fill because he played on the solos on her records, you know what I mean? And he did her records before me. And so he was like a big brother to me musical. And he was a generous man too. He let me know what he was doing and how to make it better. And so she brought in Billy Payne from Little Feat and Gary Malaber on drums and John Hall and Fred Tackett on acoustic guitar. And so I just had to hold down the fort and come up with some interesting parts. And I think I did on that. And so the next record she did just her live band, which is very rare, for an solo artist to go into the studio with her live band. And so I did Sweet Forgiveness. And that was her first gold record, that single of Runaway.
Yeah. And how long did you stay with her?
I left her band in 1980. So I was with her from 74 to 80. And I moved here.
Yeah, tell me how that happened. You met Jimmy Johnson in a hotel in L.A.?
I did. I had met Duncan Cameron, who was playing in the Amazing Rhythm Aces, and they'd just done a record here with Jimmy Johnson producing it. And he introduced me to Mike Barnett, who was the record company. They'd started their own record label here, and Mike Barnett was over it. And Duncan and I were just hanging out as guitar players, and he's the one, Duncan actually, the first guy who made me sit down and listen to Mac McAnally's Cutting Corners because he just played on it. And so Duncan was a great contact, and a friend, delightful guy, great guitar player, super talented. And I learned from Duncan, just hanging out in his house, I'd pick up little things. And one day he said, I want you to meet Jimmy Johnson. And he was in a hotel room. He was at the Sunset Marquis. And so they brought me over there, and they said, this is Will McFarlane, and he's been with Bonnie all these years, but he just left her band, and he's looking for the next thing he's going to do in life. And Jimmy goes, well, play me a song. And so I played him a song.
Do you remember what you played?
I played him a song called Secret Side.
Is it an original?
It was an original I'd written, yes. And she's your woman, your friend, but time and again the truth will come and go. But you help when you can, you're glad you're her man, and you love to let her know. But don't give it all away if you want her to stay. Keep a secret or two, a secret side of you. Because some men search in vain through the heartache and pain as far as they can go. But is it wise to uncover the things in your lover you may not want to know? Give her room to be herself. She'll wind up as someone else. Keep a secret or two, a secret side of you. And I sing this song to him, and he goes, well, play me something I don't like. And he said, I would love to demo that. And as a matter of fact, he flew me right down here like the next month. We demoed it, and he put the studio band together with Roger, David, Clayton, Randy, Mac McAnally, and Duncan Cameron. That was his first studio band. And then he brought in Lenny, Eddie Struzik, and Robert Byrne to do background vocals. I mean, I was in rare air. And he demoed it and pitched it to McGuinn Hillman, who Wexler was here producing at the time, and they cut it, actually. So he signed me to their publishing company right off the bat. I went back to L.A. and gave everybody notice. And I was getting studio calls. I was a guy in LA that if you couldn't get James Burton, there were a lot of brilliant guitar players like Larry Carlton and Jay Graydon and these guys that were the 335 guys. I was a telly guy, Strat guy, and if you couldn't get James Burton, they might, like I played on some of the Urban Cowboy soundtrack and was doing things. So I thought I had a career as a session guy in LA, but when I came down here and wasn't in a traffic jam for 3 days, in LA, you could sit in your car for 4 hours and get 38 miles on it someday. And so I just gave everybody notice. They all thought I was committing career suicide. And I headed across the Mojave Desert with my young family and moved here in 1980.
So let's talk a little bit about Jimmy Johnson, because
I'd love to.
I know in many ways he's, kind of almost a father figure for you, I guess, or a mentor. And he's probably one of my favorite guitar players in the world, and I'll tell you why. And somebody else, like Steve Cropper, or you take those early Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section recordings and you take the rhythm guitar out and they fall flat on the floor.
You're exactly right.
And he just exactly knew or felt what it needed to make those records groove the way they needed to groove.
That's like I'll Take You There. He just scratches. He doesn't even voice a chord.
Absolutely.
But you take that out of the track and it doesn't gallop anymore.
And he's so so important to that sound. And there's not many guitar players who ever did that as effectively. Just being part of the rhythm section, really to almost be a percussionist rather than a guitar player. And to me, that's like, nowadays even more, it's so overlooked and underrated at the same time, because you're not the hotshot if that's what you play, but there's so many guitar players that might be able to copy, Eddie Van Halen solos note for note, but when they really need to be the meat and potatoes, they can't do it. So tell me a little bit about your relationship with Jimmy.
Well, I absolutely owe so much to Jimmy Johnson and how much he taught me how to get things on tape. Like here, I had already done LA recordings. I've done Bonnie Raitt records. I moved down here, but I went to school with Jimmy. Jimmy, I think I appeared at a good time for him too, because he was ready to sit on the other side of the glass a lot more. And he wasn't, he didn't have to be on the floor. And I, in a way, became his sort of, he wasn't just my mentor. I became his alter ego in a way, because I could do the simple stuff, but he could say, I want, this kind of solo or this or that. And I think he also liked the idea that he could go, I want a Bobby Womack thing here. Or I knew who these people were. I knew, this is more of a Buddy Holly thing. Or could we get a Lukather tone on
you? And that's still true to this day. You have this chameleon-like quality to step in all these directions without abandoning who is Will McFarlane, but kind of you're like, you're a toolbox in many ways, and you rarely ever run out of vocabulary.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that makes you great, because and there must be a lot of listening, a lot of soaking all of that up and analyzing it too. But I think that's one thing that that everybody who has Will McFarlane on the floor knows they can just dip in all of that, and it makes a producer work real easy, because it's like, I can hire you to track a whole record even if it's all across the board, because I know you can tap into this, you can tap into this, you can tap into this, and you make it so easy for me.
I appreciate that. Good. I tell people I'm not mind-blowing or excellent at anything, but I'm real good at a bunch of stuff. You know what I mean? I'm not like a super technical speed guy, but I tip my hat in a lot of different directions. And it's because I love a lot of kinds of music. I loved listening to the band, but I loved listening to Merle Haggard, but I loved listening to Chuck Berry, and I loved listening to Otis Redding or Ray Charles. And also working with Clayton Ivey in a lot of ways. he's never met a half diminished he didn't like. So even if it's in a 3-chord country song, he'll somehow or another
sneak one
in movement towards one of his songs. And he would, if I walked with him, maybe just on a bass note, he'd go, put the D flat on top of that half diminished. And I think, well, wait a minute, it's all I can do to just, And so I learned a lot of theory in building chord structures by being in headphones with great players. And I love to listen and go, oh, is that what they're doing? And Jimmy would sit on the glass and he'd go, Will, first of all, we need some rhythm, chinks here. And so I might go out and he'd go, nah, not 2 and 4 on this one. Let's go and of 2. 1, 2, jack, jack. Or he might go, let's go 1, jack, jack. That's what you're talking about. Is he almost very rarely ever just went like that. He mixed it up like he's the rhythm guitar player on like Misty Blue for Dorothy Moore and things like that you don't realize are starting all over again. Jing, 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 jing. Put delay on it, and he's that guy. He's very creative with where he likes to place. So whenever I'm working, like for you, for like on Carla's record, I many times tried to listen to the maybe do I moved into New York City the first year after I was with Bonnie because Paul Siegel called me and said, Cornell Dupree's playing 4 nights a week with Steve Gadd and Richard T. and Gordon Edwards.
How great Stuff was.
And this was pre-Stuff. They weren't even Stuff yet. They were just session guys playing. And then Eric Gale started showing up and Dave Sanborn and, and Chris started showing up playing with Steve. I mean, how great are they? I mean, And so I moved into New York City and sublet an apartment and sat at Cornell Dupree's feet 3 nights a week when I was home. And he had a rhythm lead style where he'd be holding down the chinks in the chops, but he'd be moving melodically. He might go, jack, that, and the track would percolate just the way he played. And it was a major influence listening to Cornell Dupree. And I started to develop that lead rhythm. It's like I move, and number charts suit me great because they're not telling me what to do. They're telling me where to land. You know what I mean? So you go to the 4 and you just might slide up on 6s, or you might do it on 4s. And I've heard so many of these wonderful old soul records and listened to so many rhythm players that my reservoir is, it's pretty full.
And another one is Reggie Young.
Oh, well, yeah, we were talking before this interview on Reggie. Reggie may be the most influential overall guitar player in my life. Reggie, and if you don't know out there in Podland who Reggie is, he's probably the entry lick to 500 chart singles you've heard. Son of a Preacher Man, Drift Away is his most seminal. I Can Help, that augmented run. Suspicious Minds for Elvis. He's the sitar on Cry Like a Baby. He's Sweet Caroline. He's everything George Strait ever did. He's the solo on Merle Haggard's That's the Way Love Goes. You've heard him. If you listen to the radio for 30 minutes, you'll probably hear a Reggie Young lick. I mean, major. I think he's the finest tracking musician in the world of all time. Maybe that's maybe subjective on my part because I love the man, but and he was generous of spirit. When I did sessions with him, he was what are you doing over there? Oh man, look at the plug into my rig. Show, he was just so generous. And so, Reggie's an amazing session guy. And so, I hold him and Cornell Dupree and Jimmy Johnson. And of course, listening to entry licks like Soul Man and that stuff, all that Steve Cropper. And then the Wilson Pickett song, I'm in Love, with that
Bobby
weird timing
Womack.
with Bobby Womack and Reggie, they're right and left. And it's like, talk about a conversation. I think that's a rhythm guitar playing masterpiece. And then, all the Al Green stuff with Teenie Hodges. And that's where I would, if I don't get to play a solo on a record, I'm good. If I feel like, man, we cut some musical, soulful tracks and I moved a little between chords, but tastefully, I'm happy, man. I feel that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. So you arrived in Muscle Shoals in the very early 80s. Muscle Shoals just off of a 15-year streak of gold,
Yes.
basically. But this is at the time where things start slowing down. and you arrived there at that time. How did you find the Muscle Shoals or the state of Muscle Shoals? Was that something that was felt? Was it something like, well, we'll keep continuing that, or was that something in the air somewhat?
Yeah, that you could tell the disappointment when people. Well, that was also the beginning of the digital age, and all of a sudden people could, they had drum machines. All of a sudden, the Linn drum had come out, and people could sit in their own house, and they're thinking, why should I go spend $1,000 a day in a studio when I can sit in my? That really became the beginning of home recording, sort of, and so the depression here. I think in 1982, if I remember, there was something like 1,500 studios closed nationwide. It was an enormous number. That may be a factoid, but it was a big number. For some reason, I remember 1,500. And so there was a discouragement, and we'd have meetings like, what do we need to do to be relevant to the music business now? And you know what I'm saying? It was a tough transition. People weren't coming here to make records that much. I mean, there still were, guys who had big money and wanted to come to a studio, but in general, the smaller budget, projects stopped booking the big major studios. And
that was just a few years after they opened a state-of-the-art facility down by the river.
Yeah, it was tough. I got here and went right into that facility and started playing with them, and I still feel incredibly honored to have been invited into that rhythm section. And it started slowing down until Malaco bought it. And even then, it's sort of a mixed bag, but I think there were certain expectations that did or didn't happen. But nonetheless, there was at least some consistent, you knew that every 6 weeks you're going to get a Malaco project, and they cut lots of tunes, you know what I mean? I mean, they'd come in for 4 days and we'd cut like 25 tunes. I mean,
a couple albums.
Yeah, we'd do a couple albums, in a row, and getting paid by the tune. And it'd be living in Alabama. It was my monthly nut, I could make my monthly nut in 4 days,
So after you came here, between then and when Malaco started coming here, what were some of the memorable projects you played on? Is there anything that sticks out in those were couple 2-3 years?
Actually, the stuff that really sticks out in those years were the gospel stuff that started to happen. There was a real spiritual revival that came through this town with a lot of musicians like Lenny LeBlanc and Cindy Richardson and me and Ronnie Eads and people got wind of it and sent projects down here like Michelle Pilar and you know what I'm saying. We started to do a ton of gospel stuff. I think anytime you have Lenny LeBlanc in your headphones, you're on a good project, you know what I mean? And so got to play for Lenny's stuff and Cindy's stuff and Michelle's. And actually, little studio over here called East Avalon, just because of Jerry Wallace and Terry Skinner writing big hits. They started to get all this production stuff, and Jerry and Terry started to use me for everything. I ended up playing guitar on the first 4 Forrester Sisters #1s. That's pretty cool. The Kindle stuff was over there. North Alabama is one of the finest places in the world to retire in a fixed income, because it's just not as expensive down here. And so if you just got a little bit of steady work, you go in and do a Forrester Sisters record, man, that's like your monthly your monthly nut or whatever. You cut 10 tracks in 2 days and it's union, and all you need is gas money after that, And so it was like we lived, I have 3 kids, and we lived very frugally here. It wasn't like those years were very frugal. And but thankfully we had good friends, and our kids, had friends, and it was down professionally in a way, but it was also a chance for, after me being gone with Bonnie on the road 180, 200 days a year, all those years, all of a sudden it gave Janet and me a chance to reconnect down here in a slower environment where I didn't have to get in my car and drive, an hour and a half to a rehearsal, in LA. And we just settled into this wonderful Southern gentility,
Yeah. How did your songwriting kind of start and progress? Was that all happening at the same time? Is that something you did very early on?
Yeah, early on, I always felt like I had songs. I'd hear melodies and I'd try to put them together. When I think back, as we talked earlier, I think they probably sounded amateurish, but I started to really play, right from my heart. I started to just, no, I want to go here, there, or I want to stay on the one here. I'm obviously a talkative person, so a lot of times lyrically, I probably overwrote. I think that a lot of progression came in trying to say the same thing with a more concise, to paint a picture in a simpler way, as opposed to telling them everything you know about it. You want to just say a few things. I think some of that just comes with aging. You just learn how to make sense with a little bit less. It's like playing the guitar. You used to feel that you had to show them you know something, and now you get hired for what you leave out. It's the same with songwriting. I believe that you learn what to leave out.
Yeah. So we're now in the early 80s, and after that, you recorded a string of Christian albums.
I did.
And moved away from here, moved back, but never quit music.
No.
And now you're in a great band called Big Shoes, which alone we could talk about for a whole episode. We'll have to come to a close here for this time, but please promise me to come back and we'll pick it up in the early 80s and we'll tell the rest of the story. And then I'll have you back again in 10 years and we'll tell the next.
That's great.
The next part. I thoroughly enjoyed you spending these past 45 minutes with me here today. I sure appreciate certainly your friendship, but also just what you bring to a session, what you bring to a show. It's just a joy being around you because you radiate, sunshine.
Well, I appreciate that.
And
well,
you're a smart guy too. So I know you're never out of an intelligent conversation with you too, and that's another thing I certainly enjoy. And just to wrap this up, and I know you mentioned that to me a couple times over the years, but we basically ran into each other 10 years ago, almost to this day, actually.
Wow.
When you got inducted into the Musicians Hall of Fame with the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section.
What an amazing generosity of them to include me, As Jimmy put it, they called him to say, we want to put the Swampers in. And Jimmy just said, well, we couldn't have done it without our friends. And he goes, well, who are your friends? And he said, at one point, Will McFarlane goes, who's he? And he goes, well, he played with Bonnie, played with us 20 years. But he also said Pete Carr and Clayton Ivey and Randy McCormick and Spooner. And just the generosity, that's just another part of their generosity to include us to go in. And I'll never forget walking along the side of that building, and you ran up to me and said, my name's Andreas, and I love the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section, and I want to meet you. And I just remember us just on the street, and you've been a delight to know ever since. And you've brought me into a lot of really fascinating projects yourself, that, Carla's record is driving music to me. I keep it in my car, and it sounds great. And so knowing you, the same thing. It's been a pleasure, Andreas.
And we'll talk about some of the projects we had the chance to collaborate on, I'm sure, next time around. You're going to be playing with Calvin Holly, and that's somebody else I'll have on my podcast before too long. I already talked to him, and he said, yeah, sure. And then we'll have you back and talk a little bit more about the guitar dynamics between you and your current, guitar slinging partner. So anyway, it's been a joy. Thank you so much for doing this, and I look forward to talking to you again.
That's great. My very good pleasure.
This was the 37th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. Thanks for listening. If you liked today's episode, please make sure to check out some of our past episodes and subscribe to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour podcast on iTunes, TuneIn, or Stitcher, or you can also listen on SoundCloud and YouTube. That's it for now. See you next time.